introduce our speaker, Sarah Nizzi. Sarah Nizzi is originally from Central Iowa and is a graduate of Drake University with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science. Her experience includes natural resource management in the private and public sector, native seed propagation, and private land management throughout the state of Iowa. Currently, Sarah covers all of Iowa, providing technical and financial assistance to farmers and landowners interested in pollinator conservation, as well as training NRCS and partner staff on pollinators and pollinator habitat. In her free time, she enjoys recreating outdoors and volunteering for a number of NGO conservation groups. And anyone who knows her probably knows that she is the resident expert on pollinators in Iowa. So we're really happy to have her here with us for this presentation. And she's going to give you guys all the information that you need to know about Iowa's bumblebees. So with that, take it away, Sarah.
All right, great. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to the Master Gardener program for allowing me to present to all of you today. I am just really humbled to see the great turnout tonight. I think that's fabulous. I recognize that some of you were on a webinar with me last night, so way to go on the webinar marathon this week. And again, thank you for that introduction. I am based in Central Iowa, but like Alicia said, I cover the whole state, just doing a hodgepodge of on-the-ground technical work, helping publish publications and doing a ton of education and outreach. And so today we'll be focusing a lot on bumblebees, but I'll also be covering native bees and some other insect groups really briefly. Oh gosh, my Mac always does that. Okay. So first of all, what is the Xerces Society? I think there may be a good portion of you that are well aware of the Xerces Society, and those of you that may not be very familiar with us at all. So it's always really important to kind of explain our organization and what it is that we do. So we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary tomorrow. So we were founded in 1979 as a butterfly conservation organization, but over the years have brought into caring and preserving wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. So we have graduated from just focusing on butterflies to now focusing on everything from freshwater mussels, fireflies, native bees, bumblebees, beneficial insects, etc. Oh, and I should mention that this picture shown here is a Xerces blue butterfly. So that is where we get our name. And this is the first butterfly to go extinct due to human land use changes. So basically habitat loss within the Bay Area of California. So Xerces is a unique organization in that there really is no other organization in the world doing pollinator conservation at the scale and like we do. So we come at conservation in many different facets. The vast majority of our staff are part of our pollinator team, such as myself, and the bulk of our work is diversifying agricultural landscapes in the public and private sector. We also have an endangered species team who, does a lot of work in terms of research and advocacy and education and outreach for imperiled and often underrepresented species that don't get a lot of limelight, and a pesticide team who is small but mighty and keeps us informed on all things pesticide related, keeping us up to date on pesticide literature, and really just all things pesticide going on in the world. And that's important for many reasons. And a few folks that are working within urban conservation landscapes, such as with cities and campuses through our Bee City and Bee Campus affiliate programs, and working with our Xerces ambassadors, which is a cohort of volunteers all across the country that basically go through a training program to learn about Xerces and become equipped with the knowledge and expertise and tools necessary to basically spread the word within their local communities about pollinator conservation. So I like to include this map. This is everyone within our pollinator team. And as you can see, we are really spread across the nation. And the red stars are all of us that are working within the public sector with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, known as NRCS. And we are either doing that at a state level, a multi-state level, or in some cases, regional levels. And the other stars represent the private sector, where individuals are working with large growers or large companies such as Cheerios or other municipalities to create pollinator habitat. But we certainly do not do this work alone. It takes many, many hands for us to be able to accomplish what we do. Our members are really the foundation in allowing us to do this great work. So we are very appreciative of all those individual memberships, as well as the additional private funding that comes our way, the many scientists that we partner with around the world, the hundreds of farmers that allow us to basically work side by side and experiment with different habitat options or organic site prep or to do monitoring, the federal, local, and state agencies that we partner with, companies, our Bee City and Bee Campus affiliates, our volunteers, and last but certainly not least, the everyday people that are doing everything they can within their local communities to improve invertebrate habitat and also providing to community science. So again, we are a nonprofit and we really appreciate those donors, and individual memberships do make up about 1/3 of our revenue. So it certainly makes a huge difference in being able for us to do what we do. Okay, so that's enough on that. But just a brief introduction there. So tonight, I should say, we're going to be covering a lot in this short amount of time, but I'm really, really excited about it because bees, and especially bumblebees, are really a joy and a passion of mine. So we're going to talk briefly about pollinators generally and their status. We're going to talk about native bees and their biology and ecology, bumblebees, the rusty patch bumblebee, how to identify bumblebees, the needs in order to provide sufficient habitat, conservation actions, community science, and lastly, the many resources that are available. So just to ensure that everyone is on the same page, I think there may be many of us who feel like we have a good understanding of pollinators, but there may be those of us on today with such a large group that really don't. So I just want to take the time to kind of sit back and do this brief overview. So pollinators are typically insects by and large. There are birds and bats that provide pollination services, but largely we are relying on insects. So that includes bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. And some of these pollinators are directly and purposely pollinating, such as bees. And these other groups of pollinators, you know, the flies, the beetles, the moths, butterflies, and wasps, are all indirectly pollinating basically by accident. They are either foraging individually for pollen or nectar and are just willy-nilly providing those services. In Iowa, we have roughly 400 native bee species, 110 reproducing butterflies, and over 2,000 moths. But again, we also have large amounts of beetles, flies, and wasps that are all really diverse groups of insects. I don't know if we have numbers necessarily statewide as to how many species we have accounted for within the state, but there are certainly scientists who debate back and forth about which one is bigger than the other, beetles versus flies versus wasps. So we can't forget that those groups of insects are contributing too. And I've sort of alluded to this already, but bees are by and large the top dog in terms of pollination. They are directly and purposely pollinating because they feed on pollen and nectar in every single life stage of their life. So really, they depend on those food sources to complete their life cycle. They are also built to be really good at pollination. They have branched hairs that help with pollen collection. They have pollen baskets on their leg where they can store their pollen, and also are able to exhibit flower constancy, which makes them really efficient. So they can go from a sunflower to a sunflower to a sunflower and be very direct and not just kind of clumsily, going about on the landscape and just visiting random flowers at a time. So from a plant perspective, that is really helpful, that they are able to do that. And they can also sense when a flower has been visited. So if it looks like someone else has already been there, they're not going to waste their time. They're going to move on to the next one. Some key characteristics of bees. I'm just going to go over some physical characteristics of some of these insects, just so we are all on the same page. And when we're out and about, perhaps we'll then be able to identify what from what. So bees typically have rounder bodies and 2 sets of wings, so 4 wings total. Females will be seen carrying large loads of pollen, and depending on the type of bee, there may be different parts of the body where that pollen is collected, but by and large, most of the time, it'll be on the hind legs. They are hairy, which again aids in collecting all of that pollen and sticking to their bodies. They have eyes on the side of their head, which will be important later, and they have long antennae. And they come in all types of shapes, sizes, and colors. The bees that we are typically most familiar with are the honeybees, but they're not a typical bee. The European honeybee is one species, a single species of bee. They were introduced to the US and they are domesticated, meaning they're managed by humans. They are different in the sense that their colonies are perennial, so individuals are able to live more than 1 year, which is not the case with our native bees. And they're social with a division of labor. So there's a queen and workers all contributing to the success of the hive. And a hive can also house thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of honeybees. So they have very, very large colonies in comparison to our native bees. Some key characteristics to honeybees. I mentioned that our native bees come in many different shapes and sizes, from being very, very tiny to, almost a couple inches in length. And so honeybees are really middle of the road in terms of size. They do look like little torpedoes in the air. Their colors can vary depending on what region they're from. I might be biased because I am Italian, but I do think Italian honeybees are probably the cutest. They're more of like a golden yellow color, but there can be just a variation of black and orange and brown. They also have pollen baskets to carry that pollen, and their eyes are hairy. Other characteristics include the abdomen, which we'll get into kind of the anatomy of a bee later on, but that latter part of the bee is not completely hairless, but it is less hairless, or has less hair than some of our other native bees. So other insects that can be mistaken for bees, wasps. They are much different if you really get to looking at them, but from a distance, they can look really similar. Wasps also have 4 wings, but they're sometimes folded and generally pretty linear compared to our bees. They are quite intimidating looking most of the time, and they have a really tiny waist. It's like someone took a belt and cinched it just really tight, and that can be very obvious or not super obvious. They're not collecting pollen, so generally you're not going to be seeing a lot of pollen, and if you do, it's really just by accident from feeding and just being in and around flowers. They're not very hairy because there's no reason to really be hairy. And again, they come in many different shapes, colors, and sizes. As larvae, they're actually predaceous, so they're not feeding on pollen or nectar. And as adults, they are feeding on nectar. So that is their main food source. Now, flies. There are a certain group of flies, bee mimicking flies, that look a lot like bees. Our syrphid flies, known as hoverflies or flower flies, look a lot like bees, but there are some very distinct differences. For example, flies only have one set of wings, so 2 wings total, and they have huge eyes that basically just take over the entire head. So it's not simply on the side of the head, it's basically majority of the head. And they have teeny tiny antennae that are very stout and thick. So that's kind of your immediate dead giveaway if nothing else. But certainly they can be hairy depending on the type of fly. And there are those flies that are purposely trying to mimic bees that make them a little challenging, but usually focusing on the head and wings will help you separate them out. All right, so now that we have a basic understanding of some of these pollinating insects, we're going to get into a bit of the unfortunate doom and gloom and the reality of it being really tough times for insects and, quite frankly, biodiversity in general. And this is not just happening within the United States, but this is a problem across the world. But in the US and in North America, 18% of butterflies are at risk of extinction. And this includes rare butterflies and, once really common butterflies. So pictured here is a regal fritillary that is considered a rare and specialist species that is in decline and is a candidate for the Endangered Species Act. But we are also seeing declines in our general, once very common butterfly species, a great example being the monarch butterfly. 28% of all North American bumblebees are at risk of extinction. In Iowa, we have 14 documented bumblebee species, 5 of which are at risk of extinction. Fortunately for us, bumblebees are a well-studied group of bees. In Iowa, we have roughly 400 native bees. In the US, we have roughly 3,600 native bees. So bees are certainly a group that are challenging to track and to really know the ins and outs of their population status. Bumblebees, on the other hand, in the US, we have 46 native species. So that helps draw it down a little bit. That's, not quite as daunting, but they're larger and they're charismatic and they're easier to find. And they typically have larger ranges and we can actually identify them to a species level. So we know a lot about them versus other native bees that are rare, specialist, have smaller ranges, and may need a microscope in order to get to the species or genus level for identification. So we're seeing that where studied, diversity, abundance, and biomass of insects and other invertebrates are decreasing. And again, this is a global occurrence, and they are decreasing at a rate in which we should be taking action. And fortunately, the flip side of all of this not so great news is that invertebrates and insects tend to be resilient if they are given the tools and the support necessary to complete their life cycles. So what is a day in the life of a bee like? So in order to conserve a species, it's really important, or a group of species, or any sort of wildlife, it's important to know the ins and outs of their everyday routines. So there's a lot kind of going on in this graph. There's a few different takeaway messages here, but I included this today just for you guys to see that depending on this is only a small segment of bees, but there's different times of the year in which these bees are present. And you'll notice the very dark green under bumblebees, they have a very long flight period. So about 6 months out of the year, we can see bumblebees out and about. But depending on other types of bees, it may only be in the early spring or later in the summer. 80 to 90% of our native bees are what we consider solitary, meaning that there is only one single female taking care of a nest. And that nest size typically is about 25 to maybe 100 offspring, so not very big, certainly dramatically smaller than what we would consider in a honeybee hive. The adults emerge to feed and mate, and only for, again, a short period of time, just a couple of weeks for some types of bees. And otherwise, about 11 months out of the year, we do not see these insects being active. The nesting style of our solitary bees is predominantly ground nesting. So they will either nest just within like bare soil just at the surface, or they can have very complex branching nest under the ground. And the remaining nest in tunnels, or what we call tunnel nesting bees. So they are occupying pithy hollow stems, dead logs, snags, and beetle borer nest. So a space that was occupied by a different insect previously. Bumblebees, on the other hand, are social. So they do have large colonies, and they do have a division of labor. They are founded by a single queen who then produces workers and has drones and all the bit. The difference between bumblebees and honeybees is, again, we have an annual colony, so they only last one season. And their nest sizes are still significantly smaller. So a healthy bumblebee colony could occupy 500 or more individuals, but that is certainly on the higher end. And we do have one species available that is used for greenhouse pollination services commercially, and that's the common eastern bumblebee. And why does that matter? Bumblebees are really, I mentioned that bees were top dog in terms of pollination, but bumblebees are like next level rock stars. There really isn't a bee that does it better than a bumblebee. They're extremely important to crops and wildflowers. Their flight period is, could be end of March all the way to early November. They're active earlier and later in the day, in cooler weather, and basically at times when other insects might not be flying around. They have variable tongue lengths, which means that they can feed on a variety of flowers, which is great for diversity. And they can learn to access from really complicated, complex flowers. And last but not least, they have a skill called buzz pollination, also known as sonication, which 8% of flowering plants require in order to pollinate. And basically what that means is a bumblebee will attach itself to a flower, like an eggplant, for example, and it will vibrate its flight muscles separate from flight, and it will shake the pollen out of the flower onto its body. And bumblebees collect a lot of pollen because they're so hairy and so big, and they can groom and move that pollen onto their pollen sacs. So I've kind of alluded to some characteristics of bumblebees already, but again, they're large in size, much larger than most of our bee species or types of bees. They're very hairy, and their coloration is generally black and yellow, especially within Iowa, with the occasional brown or rusty color. But in other parts of, and just other areas, they can have white or red or orange mixed in there as well. And again, typical of all the other bees, they have those pollen baskets on their hind legs. Females do. Now, the colony of a bumblebee is founded by a queen. So a queen will overwinter, and then in early spring, she will emerge and diligently look for a nest site and compete with other queen bees for the best one, queen bumblebees, I should say. She will then start laying eggs and producing workers. She'll stay in the nest, and the workers will then emerge and go out and collect pollen and nectar to feed the young and defend the nest. Later in the season, males and new queens are produced, and they will emerge and hopefully mate with an individual from a different nest. Once the males have mated, they will die back, and newly mated queens will then forage and collect reserves before overwintering and starting the colony all over again. Bumblebee nests can basically take form in a lot of shapes and sizes. So our tall bunch forming grasses, mulch, ample organic matter, brush piles, rock piles. All of those could be bumblebee nest sites, but the common denominator amongst all of these is those insulated cavities. For whatever reason, bumblebees really seem to like, for example, abandoned rodent nests for nest sites, wherever those may be found. In terms of overwintering, their habits are still a bit of a mystery to us. There's a lot of research that has yet to be fully explored, but based off what we do know, we can kind of infer that they utilize woodland edges, certainly areas within people's yards, if you have leaf litter or bare ground, within rotten wood. But again, it's certainly a realm that we need to learn more about. And we actually did launch a community science program, I don't know, 2 years ago or so, called Queen Quest, where we are hoping to gain some more information about the habits of overwintering queens. All right, so moving on to the rusty patch bumblebee. I know that there are people likely from all over the state, and this information might not be as applicable to them because rusty patch bumblebee does not occupy the entire state, but since it is a federally endangered species, it is worth talking about. So it does really only occupy about an eastern half or a third of the state. And what we have learned over the years is that our records indicate that it really favors riparian and woodland habitats. So a lot of the sightings that we have are along river corridors. This map here is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as of March of this year. And if you can see it well enough, the very light gray counties that are marked outlines its historical range. So the rusty patch bumblebee used to be present across much of the upper Midwest, mid-Atlantic, and northeastern regions of the United States. It has since declined by 87% in the last 20 years and is only found in 0.1% of its historical range and seems to be holding on within the upper Midwest region. In Iowa, we are fortunate for couldn't tell you why exactly, but within these regions, we are still finding records of rusty patch bumblebee. And quite frankly, this past summer, for Ames, Iowa, at least, they had many records of rusty patch bumblebees. So I think it was a decent year. And this map shows the same thing, just zoomed in, but the red indicates where a verified sighting was with a slight buffer around that. So I believe that's what they consider a high priority zone. And then the yellow is an additional buffer, which is basically a dispersal zone. So the red is you're likely to find a rusty patch bumblebee. The yellow is you may perhaps find a rusty patch bumblebee. The nesting biology of rusty patch, it is one of the bumblebee species that emerges really early and goes dormant quite late. So compared to other species, it does have a long flight window, and nests can be quite extensive, going 1 to several feet underground and branching, 1.5 feet to several feet out from under that. And a healthy colony can support a large amount of individuals. Rusty patch is a species that tends to have high colony rates, so long as that colony is healthy. This is another way of looking at really that flight period and when you can expect to see queens, workers, and males. So you'll see early in the spring and later in the fall is when queens are most active. Those workers are really active a good portion of the year, and those males being later in the season. August and September is a really wonderful time to be out and about looking for bumblebees because you can come across a queen, a worker, or a male. So when you come across these bumblebees, how are you going to be able to tell what is what? So this is the fun part of identification. And there are many context clues that can help with identification versus just looking at the physical characteristics. So range, where within the state are you located? Are you, is this species, that can help kind of narrow down what you might see. There are statewide species, but there are other species like the rusty patch bumblebee that are not going to be found in Southwest Iowa, for example. What time of year is it? Is it the spring? Is it the fall? Are we going to be looking at queens, workers, or males? What kind of habitat are we in? And likely we're going to have to either catch the bumblebee or photograph the bumblebee in order to really get an accurate identification. And I have an asterisk next to catch because we can't catch every bumblebee that's out there. Rusty patch bumblebees are federally listed, so you need a permit to handle them. And so we should not be catching rusty patch bumblebees, only take photos of those. So looking at the anatomy of a bumblebee, it's important to be able to recognize, first and foremost, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. These are really critical features that can have different color patterns depending on the species. And also just looking for the antennae, the compound eyes, the amount of wings, the pollen baskets, all of those other features that kind of let you know, yes, I am in fact looking at a bee. And the corpicola or the pollen basket can help determine if you're looking at a male or a female. And in the abdomen section, there are segments that are called tergites, and they can be labeled if you're looking at resources, starting from the top of the abdomen as T1, T2, T3, etc. So understanding those segments and being able to pick them apart is really helpful for identification. There are differences between males and females. Females are generally larger in size. They do have a stinger present because they are caring for young and defending the nest. And their legs are going to be wider because they are carrying the pollen and taking care of the young. Males do not have a stinger because they are simply out to feed and mate. They are not defending anything. They have smaller bodies. They have skinnier legs because they're not going to be carrying pollen. And they have large eyes and larger antennae generally because they need to be able to find the females. In Iowa, we have a handful of very common statewide species. And first and foremost, it's the common eastern bumblebee. It's probably the #1 most common bumblebee out there. Followed by two-spotted bumblebee, brown-belted bumblebee, which is often confused for rusty patch, and the black and gold bumblebee. And these are all examples of workers. Another somewhat common species is the American bumblebee. And this can be a tricky one, and what I think is one of the most challenging identifications because it's easily confused with black and gold. So these again are examples of workers, and this tip that I'm offering you is only good for workers. It doesn't help you when it comes to males or queens. But something that I learned this year because I came across a lot of American bumblebees, which was great, is that T1, that first segment, is going to have black and yellow, versus the black and gold bumblebee is going to be straight black. So as you can see, there are other differences where you're like, well, why pay attention to that? Can't you tell that the head is different and the thorax looks a lot different between the two? And yes, that is very true. But when we are in the field, it can be very hard to pinpoint all of those other different characteristics unless we're able to collect the specimen itself or take pictures from lots of different angles. So if we're unable to do any of those things, that's just kind of my tip that I love to share now. And we can't have this webinar without also diving into the rusty patch bumblebee identification. And since it's a federally endangered species, we are going to talk about queens versus males versus workers. But as you can see, the worker and the male are pretty like distinct. They've got some pretty unique characteristics going on. They can be confused with other species, like I said, the brown belted. But one thing when looking at workers or males that's really going to let you know that you're looking at a rusty patch is the rusty patch. And a colleague of mine came up with this, and I really love to steal it from her, is that basically that is the jelly within a sandwich. So the T1 is going to be yellow, then you're going to have your rusty patch or brown or reddish color, and then you're going to have yellow underneath. So if you don't have the yellow sandwiching the rusty color, you are likely not looking at a male or worker rusty patch bumblebee. The thorax also has that weird spaceship thumbtack looking design. I'm not sure what to call it, but it's pretty iconic and pretty unique. So that can help be another tip in terms of looking at those. But the queen kind of seems a little drab. It's like, well, what's so special about that? But really, she is in the sense that her thorax is completely yellow minus that black dot, and that the T1 and the T2 are completely yellow. I personally have not seen a queen rusty patch, but I hope to someday, and I hope to be able to identify her accurately. So now that we have an understanding of these groups of insects and pollinators, how can we best support pollinators? I mentioned earlier that invertebrates and insects can be quite resilient if they're given everything that they need. So although there are many declines out there, we can help to reverse those declines by providing habitat. And habitat ensures that they have nesting cover, food, and overwintering sites, which are very, very important, as well as being able to breed with one another. So early foraging habitat is critical, especially for those early emerging native bees and queen bumblebees. Our trees and shrubs bloom a lot sooner than some of our other native prairie species, for example. And our woodland spring wildflowers also are a great food source in the early season. Moving on to later in the spring and through the summer and the fall, we're going to be looking at pollinator and nectar plants. So pollen is providing protein and lipids, and there are certain native species that are only providing pollen. So pictured on the left is spiderwort, and the right is foxglove penstemon. So those are examples of plants that do not provide nectar, they only provide pollen, and partridge pea is another. But thankfully, we do have a wide variety of native flowering plants that provide both pollen and nectar. Nectar is the carbohydrates and amino acids, basically the energy that keep these critters going. And milkweed is an example of a native plant that provides only nectar. And when we think about monarch butterflies, nectar plants come up time and time again, and they are super important because, again, they're providing that energy to fuel monarchs to get to Mexico. Nesting and overwintering habitat can really look the same and provide both services. So again, those brush piles, rock piles, leaving the leaves, trimming your vegetation down in the spring to about 18 to 24 inches or so, and overall just leaving your spaces just slightly messier is probably going to check both of those boxes, whether that be your backyard, your acreage, your farmstead, etc. And conservation can really take place at any scale. Even if you are living in an apartment that happens to have a balcony, if you're able to have some potted plants, preferably native ones, they will find you and they will utilize that. And that in and of itself is better than nothing. So I like to say that big or small, every effort counts, and there's many different places that we can put in habitat to provide for pollinators and other invertebrates and wildlife. So at Xerces, we just have a few key takeaways on how to take action. And this also counts for our pollinator pledge. So planting natives, providing that overwintering and nesting habitat, avoiding or eliminating pesticides, and posting signage, letting people know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and why it's important and why it matters. So that is extremely critical. Community science is basically another step if you want to kind of graduate or go even further with it, and you find that you're really interested in bees or other animals or plants even. There are multiple platforms in which you contribute to science, and essentially there's not enough of us in the world to keep track of all of the species out there and to keep up with the population trends. So much of the information that we have for rusty patch bumblebee, for example, especially with Iowa, many of those records are contributed by just everyday people that are finding them. Some of them are recorded by state or federal agencies, but many of them are just everyday people. And one fun story is just happened a couple years ago, where we hosted a couple workshops to educate people on bumblebees and rusty patch. And we put it in an area where there was no record, and we found one. So that's something that I'm really proud of, and that we collectively, all of our partners, the DNR, Lynn County Conservation Board, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that we were just over the moon about. So at Xerces, we have Bumble Bee Watch, which is administered by a number of different organizations, where you can submit photos and either walk through the identification process, or perhaps you already know what it is. You can insert that information on your own, and scientists will verify it. In Iowa, we have lots of records, although I kind of put this up here because I think we could use just a little bit more. And those of you that may be in southern or northwestern Iowa, there are bumblebees there. So I would like to see a few more dots in that region. But again, a lot of this got very popular, and people were really into it after learning about rusty patch bumblebee. Other platforms that are super popular to most people, iNaturalist, where you can record plants and animals, and Insects of Iowa, which I like to also contribute to. And again, scientists and federal agencies and people that are making decisions about these animals look at this information in order to be sure that we're making the right decisions. Tips for photographing bumblebees: don't be afraid to get close. They're very docile. Bees in general are pretty docile unless you bother them, on purpose. Make sure that you get all the angles you possibly can, so you can see all those different features and colorations. And last but not least, we have resources. Xerces has a plethora of resources on our website. If there's something specific that you're interested in, I can always get that for you. It might be easier for me to find, but just know that there's lots of things that exist out there. Thankfully, we have Bumblebees of Iowa, the brochure and ID guide that came out a few years ago, that you can download and print off on your own if you're interested. And if bees are really something that you're super passionate about, bumblebees are certainly the gateway drug. They're really where you should start, and it certainly gets more difficult after that, but it'll really help kind of lay the foundation for native bees, and help with identification that will then kind of help when it gets more difficult with those other genera of bees. And bumblebees in North America is a must-have. And with that, I would like to take a moment just to support all of our large donors for Xerces. Again, couldn't do that without them. And now we have some time for questions. So thank you very much.